3 days after the Normandy landing, that is, on June 9, 1944, the northern coast of France appeared like a picture of devastation. Destroyed landing ships lay scattered on the sandy beach. American tanks were overturned, many heavily damaged after fierce battles. Trucks and military vehicles were burned out, leaving only bare iron frames. Oil, burned metal, and gunpowder smoke still lingered in the air. That was the direct consequence of one of the fiercest battles of World War II, the landing in Normandy, also known as D-Day. To reach that historic day, preparations had begun many months earlier. In January 1944, in Chesapeake Bay in the United States, units of the U.S. Coast Guard participated in special training sessions. They were trained on how to move from massive transport ships down to small boats, which would be the main means of bringing soldiers to the shores of France. The exercises were repeated many times, because even a single mistake in reality could lead to heavy casualties. By February, a series of transport ships began leaving U.S. ports, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic. This journey lasted many days in cramped and deprived conditions. The soldiers passed the time by writing letters to their families, mending their uniforms, or chatting with comrades. But in their hearts, they all knew that ahead lay a life or death challenge. In March, the coast of England became a gigantic training ground. Hundreds of tank landing ships and troop landing ships continuously practiced bringing troops and vehicles ashore. Soldiers rehearsed running on the sand, capturing simulated defensive positions. In the air, Allied aircraft simulated bombings to clear the way for a real attack. All of this was to help them familiarize themselves with the environment they would later face. In April, the atmosphere of war became even more evident. Allied aircraft began a large-scale bombing campaign on German infrastructure in France, from bridges and roads to railroads and fuel depots. The goal was to weaken the German supply and defense capabilities, so that on the day of the landing, they could not react quickly. Parallel to that, in England, soldiers continued advanced training, practicing night landings, rehearsing in simulated smoke and fire, and learning how to care for the wounded right on the beach. In May, everything entered the final preparation phase. Millions of rations, hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition, tens of thousands of vehicles from jeeps and trucks to heavy artillery were loaded onto ships. Engineers even designed the artificial Mulberry Harbors, an unprecedented engineering feat, built from old sunken ships to create breakwaters. This would be the solution to ensure supplies once the campaign began. By the end of May, a massive force was ready, just awaiting the order to move out. At the beginning of June 1944, the atmosphere in the barracks and on the ship decks was tense to the point of suffocation. On June 3rd, 3 days before the landing, the first groups of soldiers boarded small boats and assembled offshore. That was the final preparation before the real battle. They sat silently in the darkness, listening to the waves crashing, watching the shadowy ships gliding quietly across the sea. No one spoke much. Everyone knew that when the sun rose, many of them might not live to return. On June 4th, bad weather suddenly struck. Rough seas and heavy rain and wind forced the operation to be postponed. The decision to delay made the soldiers' spirits even heavier. They had prepared mentally for the moment of life and death, but now had to wait another day in anxiety. On June 5th, the weather improved. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower made the historic decision: we will proceed. Thousands of ships began leaving English ports, heading out into the English Channel. That night, over 150,000 soldiers waited silently on the ship decks. Some wrote final letters to their families, some prayed, others just sat motionless, staring into the darkness. It was an unusually quiet night, as if all of history was holding its breath before turning to a new page. At dawn that day, the largest operation in modern history began. As the first light appeared, salvos of artillery from Allied warships fired simultaneously. The explosions thundered across the sky. Hundreds of shells rained down on German fortifications on the Normandy coast, turning many defensive positions into rubble. In the air, hundreds of fighter and bomber aircraft swooped in, dropping bombs on the enemy's fortified targets. Some ships even launched barrages of rockets inland to clear the way for the infantry. It was a rain of fire opening the curtain, signaling the greatest attack of the century. Immediately after the artillery barrage, hundreds of landing craft loaded with American soldiers began advancing toward the shore. This was the first wave of attack. When the ramps of the boats dropped, the soldiers immediately jumped into the freezing water, carrying their guns and heavy backpacks. trying to advance toward the sandy beach. But from above, the Germans immediately opened fire with machine guns and mortars. Bullets flew relentlessly. Many fell right as they left the boats. Blood stained the sea red. At Omaha Beach, where German firepower was the densest, the scene was particularly brutal. Waves of American soldiers fell right at the water's edge, before even reaching the sand. At Utah Beach, thanks to a slight deviation in the landing position, the Americans avoided many machine gun nests, resulting in fewer casualties. Meanwhile, British and Canadian troops at Sword Gold and Juno beaches also faced barbed wire, minefields, and fire from underground bunkers, but they still advanced step by step. The survivors clung to the iron and wooden obstacles that the Germans had planted on the beach to prevent landings. They used those very barriers as cover. Every meter of ground was rested with blood. Behind them, the U.S. Coast Guard performed another task: rescue. Their ships charged straight into the danger zone, pulling wounded soldiers floundering in the water onto the decks for bandaging. Many bodies were also recovered so as not to be swept away by the waves. At the same time, larger ships like troop transports approached the shore, bringing more troops to reinforce the captured positions. A two-way flow began to form. Wounded were transported back out to sea, to hospital ships for emergency treatment. Meanwhile, from offshore, new waves of troops, vehicles, and weapons continued to pour in. When the beach was temporarily safer, the massive tank-carrying ships dared to approach closer. The doors opened, and American tanks rolled down onto the sand one by one, bringing heavy firepower to expand the bridgehead. Once the initial assault waves had secured a foothold on the beach, the next task for the Allies was to consolidate and expand the bridgehead. Thousands of soldiers continued to land in the following days. Combat engineers urgently cleared mines, destroyed obstacles, and built temporary roads for vehicles to move. Tanks, trucks, heavy artillery were brought ashore one after another, gradually reinforcing the newly captured battlefield. At the same time, thousands of German prisoners were captured. They were transported back out to sea, then transferred to prison camps in the rear. The collapse of coastal defensive positions forced the Germans to gradually retreat inland. The road from Normandy to Paris and further to Berlin was officially opened. One of the most important innovations at this time was the artificial mulberry harbors. The Allies sank many old ships to create breakwaters, then installed floating piers and docks. Thanks to this structure, thousands of tons of food, fuel, and weapons could be brought in each day, despite harsh weather. The Mulberry Harbor became a decisive factor in ensuring the campaign was not interrupted. However, nature did not stand aside. Less than 2 weeks after D-Day, on June 19th, a massive storm suddenly hit the English Channel. Huge waves and strong winds sank many ships, destroying part of the artificial harbor. Hundreds of sailors and soldiers perished in this disaster. It was said that the sea also demanded its share of sacrifices. Among those losses was the rescue ship nicknamed the Flying Angel. The ship that had bravely charged into the fire zone to save the wounded on June 6th was now swallowed by the waves. A young sailor named Bill Jackson lay forever beneath the sea. His story, though small amid tens of thousands of lives, symbolized the silent sacrifices of countless people who contributed to the victory. On shore, the military chaplains, the spiritual soldiers, had the most difficult task: writing death notification letters to the families of the fallen. In those letters, they tried to offer comfort while conveying pride that the son, husband, or father had fallen for freedom. Many chaplains admitted that this was a heavier job than witnessing death on the battlefield, because each letter sent shattered a heart back home. When the gunfire subsided, Normandy was left with beaches full of steel, but above all, memories of courage and sacrifice. The landing on June 6, 1944, was not just a battle, but a decisive turning point in World War II. It opened the path to liberate France, leading the Allies straight to Berlin and ultimately defeating Nazi Germany. But beyond its military value, Normandy left an eternal message: freedom is never free. It is always traded with blood, tears, and the sacrifices of previous generations. Countless heroic acts took place that day, which no film or pen could fully recount. That is the legacy Normandy left for the world. Normandy is not just a story from the past, it is a reminder of what courage, sacrifice, and unity can achieve. The men who went ashore on June 6, 1944, many of whom never returned home, gave us the gift of freedom we enjoy today. Their voices may be gone, but their legacy lives on in every free nation that rose from the ashes of war. If you believe stories like this must continue to be told, I invite you to keep this history alive with us. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with family and friends. Your support helps us honor the memory of those who fought and ensures that the next generation understands the price of peace. And most importantly, leave us a comment. Do you or your family have a story connected to World War II? Have you heard about Normandy from a parent, grandparent, or neighbor who lived through it? We would love to hear your voices and preserve those memories together. Because freedom is never free, and remembering is the least we can do.